Hello, this is Natalie Hinze, and this is me and my colleagues' presentation over the Challenger shuttle incident and how better communication could have prevented the event entirely. But before we begin, I'd like to stress this, I can't stress this enough, that great communication begins with connection. Unfortunately, this is not the case for the tragic Challenger explosion, but I feel like everyone should know at least a little bit about the Challenger incident, not just because it's history, but because it's a great lesson. The lack of communication during the developmental process deserves to be studied and understood, as learning from this disaster is the only way to prevent another in the future. Whether it be for everyday life or professional environments, everybody needs some sort of communication. I think we can all agree on that. But I actually have an odd connection to the Challenger explosion. Growing up before I moved to Angleton, I actually used to go to the Challenger Elementary in Pearland, Texas, which was named after the tragic incident. So I grew up knowing like a little bit about the incident through the teacher that was on the shuttle, because it was a big thing for our school apparently. They were cheering her on from the sidelines, unfortunately. And we all saw how that ended. But other than that, I also grew up knowing about it through just the artwork and all the astronauts that were on the walls at the time. So I feel like I grew up knowing about it more than most people have. But in this presentation, we as colleagues will be explaining to our classmates how the tragic explosion could have been prevented by pointing out errors in NASA's communication system during the developmental period. If NASA directors properly assessed the launch site, had a better communication system, and didn't give in to political and public pressure, this tragic event would have avoided becoming history entirely.
Hello everyone, my name is Lyndsey Rodriguez, and today me and my colleagues will be discussing the Challenger explosion. So to start off this presentation, we would like to first discuss where we believe that the first issues started to arise, and that was the launch site. So if NASA directors had properly assessed and took into consideration all the environmental factors in play and thoroughly looked over the rocket and given it that final once-over before launch, this tragedy may have overall been avoided. So there are some environmental factors that play a major role in leading into this disaster. The night before the launch, there was a major cold front that rolled through, and it deposited large patches of ice onto the launch pad. There were also very large icicles left on the shuttle from the cold, and due to this, the launch had been delayed. With the icicles that were found on the shuttle, it could indicate that the shuttle was damaged during the cold front and when it came through. So, given this information, if the shuttle had been given a final once-over before launch, the damaged O-rings could have been found and the launch could have been delayed longer, and it could have prevented this whole disaster. Not only is the weather a major leading factor in the whole disaster and tragedy, but so is the lack of communication, or rather the lack of communication.
Not only was the weather one of the major contributing factors to the tragedy of the Challenger, but so was the communication, or the lack of communication, which would be a better way of putting it. The Challenger engineers and technicians had observed the Challenger, and they had observed the O-rings, and the O-rings are essentially the seals of the boosters, and the material that the O-rings are made out of is called FKM rubber. And with the wear and tear that the Challenger had already faced due to overuse, the extreme temperatures the previous night also added more wear and tear to the O-rings. So when the engineers had observed these O-rings, they were concerned, but they did test the O-rings, but one thing that they did forget to test was extreme temperatures on the O-rings. And these O-rings were going to be facing extreme temperatures when launching into space. So the data that the engineers had given NASA was not completely accurate. It was incomplete because that one thing had been left out of the testing. So they brought their concerns to the decision makers or the higher-ups of NASA, but these higher-ups kind of didn't see a lot of concern, and that was because they were relying on incomplete and not completely accurate data. So, with all the issues that had led up to the launch, NASA was already on edge. But in addition to being on edge, they were also facing other pressures.
Now, in addition to all of the previous points that are mentioned, NASA also found itself under very extreme political pressure due to prior incidents, and it did not make it any easier that the schedule they were trying to uphold was incredibly strict. Now, President at the time, Ronald Reagan, was set to give his State of the Union address, and NASA was speculated to be a very big talking point. Now, in addition to NASA, one of the main points of the State of the Union address was going to be education. And NASA saw its opportunity to get its way out of some unfavorable public opinion that it had found itself in due to prior incidents because they were sending a teacher to space. They saw the correlation between the talks about education and sending a teacher to space. So they wanted to make sure that the rocket launch went off without any delays in order to be done before the State of the Union address. Now, in addition, the launch pads were in need of refurbishment, but the Challenger launch had gone through so many delays already that the refurbishments kept on getting pushed further and further back because of one reason or another. And then whenever it finally came time for them to really hunker down and make these preparations or these refurbishments, the weather conditions that were mentioned previously befell the Challenger rocket, and they went ahead and sent the rocket, or they went ahead and approved the rocket for taking off, which is no doubt one of the larger reasons that the Challenger explosion occurred. And this point and the two ones prior are all huge contributing factors as to why the Challenger explosion happened.
As we discussed, there were numerous areas in which those in charge of the Challenger failed to communicate properly and meet all the requirements necessary to ensure a safe expedition. From the launch site not being thoroughly assessed, failure from the technicians to communicate concerns, and the political situation that NASA found itself in at the time, all these factors contributed to the now infamous Challenger explosion. All in all, the case of the Challenger rocket and its explosion were a tragic loss of human life. Nothing can make up for those people who died that day, but going forward, it is crucial to understand the areas in which the Challenger fell short in order to prevent another disaster like this from happening in the future. And as all, I hope that everybody enjoyed me and my colleagues' presentation, or our colleagues' presentation, and I hope that y'all all have a lovely day.